All right, so what we're going to do today is actually talk about Chapter 6, and we're talking now about biodiversity conservation, and we're talking in terms of ecosystem-wide. So we're going to look at basically also talk about habitats. How do we conserve habitats with, on the other hand, knowing that man, with our 8 billion people, 7 something at least, needs to be able to use these resources. And so how do we go about looking at this issue of biodiversity, reducing extinctions, but in this case, reducing destruction of ecosystems and habitats in a broad scale. Sometimes we call this ecosystem management. So first thing I'm going to talk about is what are forests and what are forest ecosystems and what's going on with them. This is a big issue, obviously. A large percentage of the world's forested, and our most diverse areas, richest areas are the tropical rainforests, as we all know. So old growth forests, uncut or regenerated, means they were cut maybe, but it's been a long time ago, 100+ years, and they've regenerated on their own or with some help. That's only 36% of the world's forests. After that, we have second growth forests. They've been cut, they've been used for agriculture, and they've had time to regrowth. And then the other option we have is actual tree plantations. So we destroy a forest or use a forest, and then we just plant one species of tree. So we're going to look, for example, at a teak plantation. So here's this beautiful old growth forest. These, I think they're called adventitious roots. Hope there's not too many botanists around to check me out on that. But this is one we visited in Costa Rica with our sustainable leadership group on many occasions. Just an absolute magical place. Lots of medicines, as we know, come from these kinds of biodiversity. This is a secondary growth one. Not a great picture, but you see much denser, lots of smaller trees. There's one old growth or recent growth tree that was left, but this is much denser, and that's secondary growth. Now, remember, we're talking primary and secondary succession here. So secondary growth comes from secondary succession. So these are still some of the pioneer plants that come in and rehab that soil and that area after disturbance. Okay, here's looking at a tree farm or plantation, and basically looking at the cycle. We plant the seedlings, 5, 10, 15 years. We take out weeds and remove the weaker trees, and we clear cut or harvest it in about 25 to 30 years in an average climate. In South Africa, where I'm from, we had a lot of these tree plantations because we didn't have natural forest. So we took some of our savanna grasslands and converted it. It's quite controversial, but converted it to pine plantations for lumber, for wood and houses and all that, and also for eucalyptus was used as the mine props to hold up the mine shafts, because South Africa is a big mining area. So very familiar, actually, on our own farm in South Africa, we had some of this. The thing we need to look at of this, of course, is natural capital. In fact, I'm going to go to all right, guess I didn't have that slide in there, I apologize. So let's look at natural capital. In this situation we're talking about with sustainability, we're talking about focusing on our natural capital. What are a forest is natural capital? What are all the services, both ecological services and economic services that they provide? Well, it provides that recycling, especially of carbon, right? When photosynthesis happens and we get all this green material, we're literally taking carbon out of the atmosphere, CO2 in this case, and putting it into long chain carbons, which are the lignins and the starches and all of that that make up a forest. So we're taking it out, we're sequestrating it, we're sequestering it back into the biomass. And that's going to be a big issue we talk about in these habitats. And a reason to keep these habitats and these ecosystems going is because of that. And other chemicals are recycled, right? Nitrogen and so forth. We're going to reduce soil erosion. We're going to absorb and release water. We've talked about that locally here. Our San Bernardino Mountains up here beyond to our south, that's where our rainfall falls, our snow falls. And over time, if we've got healthy forest up there, it absorbs that water, goes into the sediments, and eventually comes out here in our groundwater down here in the Mojave, bottom end of the Mojave watershed here. These big fires, these catastrophic fires we've had now have changed that, and we've got a whole denuded area. So we're going to have a lot of flooding, a lot of mudslides, that kind of thing this next year in those areas. So purify water, of course, as it goes through, they purify water and air. Influence local and regional climate. So if we change something, I noticed for the first time, not really climate, but it kind of is. First real dust storm we've had at our place out towards Lucerne Valley was the other day. And it was dust coming off those new fires, the Blue Cut fire, and forget the name of the other fire right now. Store atmospheric carbon, we talked about that. That's part of the chemical cycling. And provides numerous wildlife habitats, right? Spend some time in our mountains up here. We live in the Mojave Desert, and that's still part of the Mojave Desert. Magical place, one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. Okay, harmful effects of logging. So what's going on with logging, and how is logging done wrong and unsustainably? Well, we're looking at things like if we put in logging roads, we know once you put the road in, then it's easy for everyone to go in legally and illegally to log. So it increases erosion, just the stuff we just looked at the other side there. Sediment runoff into waterways, habitat fragmentation, loss of biodiversity. Here's one we haven't talked about yet, but if we log in the wrong way, we allow non-native pests and diseases and wildlife species to come in. And that's going to be an issue for us to mine. And also, we then also give access to miners and hunters and off-road vehicles. And of course, that needs to be managed. Off-road vehicles in our local forests are allowed. So is mining, so are hunters, because they're multiple use. The agency, in that case, that manages a lot of that, the U.S. Forest Service, part of U.S. Department of Agriculture, is a multiple use agency. All these folks can use it under proper regulation. Okay, so here we go. Look at it, a new highway coming into an old growth forest. This is an area looking more, this would be more tropical. First, the trees are burnt down. Maybe some of the stuff is harvested and it's put into agriculture, mostly subsistent agriculture, or in places like Brazil, into big time industrialized agriculture for maize, corn, and soybean and things like that. But in here we're actually showing burning the forest. But that changes very quickly. Those nutrients with high rainfall leach through the soil very quickly, and pretty soon you've got a pretty denuded landscape, kind of like some of those pictures I showed you in Costa Rica where we've got the big scars from erosion. Deforestation, same sorts of issues that we just looked at. All these are the same negative effects when we degrade that natural capital. And deforestation is going to happen, but how are we going to do it sustainably? And that's what we're going to look at. Okay, where is it happening? Well, it's happening to a large degree in the tropical forests. I want to point out that Latin America, Indonesia, and Africa, we have a real issue here with poverty and exponential population growth. So these forests happen to be in the areas where they're hardest to manage because the people need those resources. And in some cases aren't as well educated as we should be to be sustainably using that resource. Okay? And then of course the boreal forests all across the northern and southern part, mostly the northern. These are the slower growing forests, the kind of stuff you see in Yellowstone. And then the last one I would put in here would be the temporal rainforests, kind of the redwoods and Olympic Peninsula, high rainfall, but temperate temperatures, cooler temperatures, shorter growing seasons. And all of them are under tremendous pressure. Okay, Eastern United States, looking at case studies, that's what we did as early pioneers. Came in, cut down the forest to grow crops. And over time, though, that stuff's been allowed to regenerate. And we've had secondary succession, and they've come back. Okay, so there's the succession. But also, we've put in biologically simplified plantations. So don't be fooled in some cases by seeing a beautiful forest on a hillside. Look at it a little more carefully. It might just be one species. It might be a tree farm plantation being grown, for example, for pulp, for paper. And it's really not a very high productive ecosystem because there's not a lot of different species there. There are not a lot of feeding niches. So it looks pretty and it's not bad. It has some of those ecological services like catching the rainfall, helps retain the roots, help prevent soil erosion. But it's not anywhere, not even in the same category as the biodiversity you're going to find in an old growth or even a secondary growth in natural forest. Okay, so for us, and in many parts of the world these days, we're seeing these issues of wildland fire. And this is a huge issue. In fact, as I've mentioned several times now, and next week you'll have a representative for the local resource conservation district come in. We are very involved in that. And on our first field trip, we'll be talking about this. We are very involved in sustainable management of our forests up here in the San Bernardino Mountains. And our issue really comes down to forest fires. And this picture here kind of tells it all, and we're going to talk about this more in the other lecture. But basically, we've got two completely different scenarios. Over here, we've got, if you notice, a wide open forest, not too many trees, some shrubbery, and we've got a low fire. It's just burning amongst the trees. Redwoods, for example, we know depend on this. I was just at the redwoods a few months ago. The closest ones are right here in Kern County, just up from Kernville. And you can see the evidence hundreds of years later where they burnt. But this is what's called a controlled burn. This should happen in the springtime. And we do this as a management technique to get rid of the extra trees. What happened in the San Bernardino Mountains here and all across the West and the United States and other first world countries, we got really good at fighting fires. So therefore, we stopped allowing fires to clean up the extra biomass, okay? And so in the San Bernardino Mountains, we estimate that per acre, we sometimes had 200 coniferous pine-like trees per acre, and we should have only had 25 per acre. So the big difference, a big imbalance there. And then when that happens, we have these catastrophic fires. This is also called a crown fire. So you can see there's a lot of wood there, a lot of trees. These are big old trees, and it's burning everything. And that is so destructive. It destroys the seed banks. It actually can scorch and seal the soil. It gets so hot that the silica, which is sand, turns to glass. Your glass is silica. So it gets this glassy coat on. And obviously, rainwater doesn't penetrate, all kinds of things. And we allow invasive species to populate. So, and we have a complete habitat transformation. What's going to happen after the Blue Cut fire out here in Summit Valley is that's all we've seen at other areas, so we know this area. It's going to turn to shrubs. Probably have very little big trees coming in unless they're planted. And that's what we'll talk about next week and on the field trip. Unless somebody comes in like we've done with the Resource Conservation District, and we've planted close to 1 million trees right now in the San Bernardino Mountains. So we have to actively manage that, and that's a sustainable practice. But the problem is that shrubbery, which would be much more dense than this, then is prone to fire because it becomes incredibly dense and it's very fire prone after that. So these fires if we don't start changing our management, then we're going to see these fires recurring on about a 5-year cycle. And very, very hard to control, obviously, because of the mountainous terrain and all of that. Okay, tropical forests disappearing very quickly. Big losses since the 50s. We've become very technologically advanced. Chainsaws, big trucks, roads, big sawmills that can cut the trees. So deforestation concerns can make a big difference to climate change, because if when we burn or release this goes in the atmosphere, those are the carbon, some of the carbon gases like methane and CO2 that we're worried about with global warming. And we'll get to that and talk about that. I think it's in about chapter 10. Okay, and also there's roles in species extinction, and that's the whole biodiversity thing. But now we're looking at, again, not species by species, but ecosystem wide. Okay, underlying causes. Why are we allowing this to happen? Well, we don't value the ecological services that they provide, the ecotourism that they've used in Costa Rica to preserve their thing, bringing people in, the medicines, the environmental water holding and climate stabilization issues. We don't value those very much. Crop and timber exports have become a big deal for many of these countries. Government policies don't support sustainable practices often. Poverty. You know, I tell a story a lot in Africa about being out in the savannah, and you can drive out, maybe not see anyone for days, literally, but you'll see Hessian or plastic bags of charcoal along these little way out there tracks. And those are people that are going out into the bush, cutting down very hardwoods and making them into charcoal. All you have to do is cover them with dirt. They burn slowly. They make charcoal. It's an export. But that's poverty. Those people depend on that just to make a little bit of extra cash to keep going. And then, of course, population growth. Again, we're back to our number one environmental issue is too many people. We've got to figure out how, A, to take care of them, but also B, to how to slow that population growth. Direct causes: roads, fires, settler farming, cash crops, cattle ranching, logging, tree plantations. We've really covered all those. Here's a picture of a teak plantation. So this would be a tropical rainforest, would have been here. They planted teak. Teak is great for making furniture if you're nice and wealthy, which I'm not. I don't have any teak furniture in my house, I don't think. But we've planted. You can see them in rows. It's all one species. So again, not a bad habitat, but pretty limited because it's only one species. Therefore, only one kind of food source, only one kind of protection from animals and all that kind of stuff. Okay, how should we manage and sustain forests? Well, we're just going to let's really focus in on the ecosystem, eco-services. Let's not be totally wound up in the economic services, the lumber and all of that produces, okay? And some of the solutions to sustainable forestry, okay? So when we estimate economic value, let's include the value of the ecosystem services. Let's identify and protect highly diverse forests. So there's certain programs now called like the Ecosystem Hotspot Program identifies these very important old growth and tropical forests, for example, all across Central Africa. And we'll talk actually later on in this about how they're doing that, debt for nature swaps and that kind of thing. Stop logging in old growth forests. We're still trying to do that even in the United States. There's still permits out there to go into redwood forests and log those. Of course, that could be done because certain of those trees will just die. So we can do some selective cutting, but we've got to be very careful how we issue these permits. Stop clear cutting on steep slopes. We'll look at what clear cutting is in a moment. Road building, stop that. Leave most standing dead trees because they're part of the ecosystem. Put tree plantations only on deforested and degraded land. So don't take a grassland habitat like we had in South Africa and convert it to a forest. Take one that's already was a forest or it was degraded for some other reason and put the forests there. Certified TIM grown for sustainable methods. Sustainable Forestry has done a great job with this, and we talked about this at the beginning of the class. You can see the stamps. They have sustainable forestry, lumber certification programs, and a lot of the big companies subscribe to that. And so they've greatly improved their techniques and their sustainability. Okay, who's going to do it? Of course, again, individuals. We know this is the focus of the class. What can we do? Well, we can practice small-scale sustainable agriculture and forestry in tropical forests. Example of this would be shade-grown coffee. You know, your Starbucks loves to talk about this, but this is where you leave the big trees and you grow the smaller coffee shrubs. They're kind of a shrubby tree, coffee trees, underneath those big trees. And they provide the shade and some of the ecosystem services for that. National governments, let's see what they're going to do in terms of subsidies. We're going to talk about one subsidy that's locally still available is to plant windbreaks to slow down the wind and prevent soil erosion. That's offered, again, through the Resource Conservation District, but funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. In subsidies, the wrong kind of subsidies on other kinds of logging. At the international level, debt for nature swaps and conservation concessions. We're going to talk about these two together. Good thing for you to look at and include in your discussion board on biodiversity, the one we're doing right now. The mega transect was a guy, Michael Fay, who trekked through the central part of Africa and just documented the incredible old-growth forests that are still left there in places like the Congo. And then he negotiated with those governments debt for nature swaps. So a lot of these were under contract from big logging companies to be logged, and basically said to the governments and to the presidents of those countries, we'll do a debt for nature swap. So you guys have a lot of international debt for your economies from the World Bank and places like, we'll swap that for nature. So what we'll say to you is, we'll swap that debt, and as long as you conserve that area and use it more for ecotourism and for the local people, and deny or rescind those timber contracts from the big logging companies. And that's a debt for nature swap. And they work very well, and they've been done to a fairly large degree. Okay, Kenya's Greenbelt is another one of the case studies in the book. This lady, I got to hear her talk once. Maatha, she won the Nobel Prize for this huge tree planting effort across Kenya. And they're not the only ones that have done that. Lots of other places have done that. Our Relief project up in the San Bernardinos, that's what it's called, the Resource Conservation District. That's basically a tree planting project as well, and it's funded with grants. Okay, sustainable forestry solutions conserve biodiversity. The rosy boa, they're talking about the mountain boa, that's it, the rosy boa and the mountain boa, very sensitive species that we base some of our conservation on up in the mountains. Replant plantations in long rotations. Reduce clear cutting and use more selective and strip cutting. We'll show you some pictures of that in a moment. You reduce nodes, keep off slopes, leave dead trees, certify, And then the last one in here, those are all really a repeat, restoration. Let's go in and actively restore. We're going to talk about that. We've done a lot of that on the mines with our department, but we've also helped with this in Costa Rica. Let's grow plants in greenhouse. Let's grow trees, and let's actively have humans help the succession to happen, the restoration to happen when there's been some deforestation. Okay, so here we go, real quick. This is what it looks like. Clear cutting. We cut everything. What you don't see there is, you can kind of see, there's a few good trees in there. Most of it, they say, I think something like 80% in an old growth forest is really not usable. It's all the little stuff. And basically, they normally just burn that. So that's just pretty much a poor waste. Rather than that, let's selectively cut. Let's leave the smaller trees, the other trees that don't have value for lumber, and let's just take out the big trees. And we can do that now. We have equipment to cranes and hoisting systems to go way in over these canyons and just selectively take out those trees. Or we can strip cut. Go in and strip cut. Now we've got shading from here, and we've got seed banks and all of that, and habitat around that to allow this to naturally regenerate. We might have to help it, but so that's strip cutting, clear cutting. Really no reason to do this other than in a plantation. Even in a plantation, now recommend that they leave some of it there just to hold the soil. Okay, so that's what we're talking about: clear cutting and strip cutting and selective cutting. Okay, solutions. So here's some of the solutions for tropical forests. Very much the same stuff we've talked about in other forests: reduce poverty, subsidize sustainable forestry use. Could do a lot here. Educate folks that are there, the settlers that are coming into the area. Protect and the most diverse areas. And here, let's do some restoration. Managing and sustaining grasslands. This isn't in the book. I've just added this in here because not all our areas are just forest. We need to look at our grasslands. And so we had huge tracts of grasslands across the middle part of the United States, but those have pretty much been put, the prairies have gone to agriculture, okay? And this is mostly used, grasslands are used for livestock grazing, and we call those rangelands, or if they're managed grasslands where we actually plant the grasses and irrigate and fertilize them, then they're called pastures, right? And so rangelands are huge in California, for example. We're still one of the largest cattle producers. And this is food we need to realize that humans don't eat. We lose this often in the conversation about eating too much meat, and lots of the methane are produced from flatulence from cattle and all this kind of stuff. Remember that they're eating shrubs and grass that we can't digest. They are a ruminant. They're anaerobic digesters that are inside. All the bacteria and the microbes can digest things that we can't digest, and they can make nutrients out of them, which they in turn into milk products or meat products that we can in turn use. So there, for many cultures, including ours, this is a very, very important alternative. But we need to manage that properly by controlling the number of livestock on the land. And we're going to talk about that in the discussion board too, is what happened in the Mojave? Did we have overgrazing? Was it really fair to take all the cattle off the Mojave right now because of concerns about them competing with the desert tortoise for food? Were we overgrazing? Well, in my opinion, we weren't overgrazing. But in this case, the more environmentally focused side of the house kind of won out. So great discussion. And again, we're trying to find that balance. Okay, if we don't manage, if we do overgraze, like it's going to have to assume that this was overgrazed here. When grasses are overgrazed, you eat them down to the ground, they actually die. They just go away. When that happens, then we can't retain the water, we lose the nutrients, and it literally turns to desert. Note that grasslands, when you just find grasslands, those are very dry areas. Those are just at the brink of a semi-desert or a desert. So we're kind of a semi-desert grassland out in the Mojave. We've got lots of grasses out there. But if we don't manage it properly, it'll turn to desert. And that's called a process of desertification. Okay? And that's really important if we allow things to be overgrazed. In lots of parts of the world, this is happening. In Africa, lots of desertification. The Sahara is moving south by 25 miles a year because of desertification. And that's because folks up there just, depend on animals for their livelihood. That's how their stature and their wealth is measured in cattle in lots of parts of Africa. And they're overgrazing. And this is something we need to help them with more sustainable ways of living. Okay, managing grasslands, it's not just about the actual number of cattle that are on there, what's called the stocking rate, how much stock per acre, but also where you put them. So we don't want them to have total access to water sources because they can actually have an effect on the water source. So this is an example of cattle on, cattle off, but we can still fence this and allow them just access to the water. Okay, so grazing study, case study in the American West. We know about the Dust Bowl. A lot of that was due to overgrazing. And so there's various things we can do. We could pay farmers conservation easements. And what that does is keep the land in agriculture. Okay, it's a U.S. Department of Agriculture does these conservation easements. Our agency helps put them together. So that we could keep the farmers on the land, because often not often, most of the time, they're the best people to manage it. They understand it, they appreciate it, they're great conservationists, great stewards of the land, but we've got to make it economically viable. In our local area, it's way more financially advantageous to them to go into development for housing, for example. Okay? Easements can help that. So that's a subsidy that can help. Pressuring government to zone the land to prevent development of ecologically sensitive areas. Yeah, and again, what we do there is the farmer then makes an easement. We've got a classic example of this in Lucerne Valley that we're actually going to visit, a very sensitive little area. It's an alkali sink, a little spring, and we're going to visit on our field trip. And yeah, if that land was to be developed for ranching or something else, you'd want to isolate that and keep that area, because there's 2 endemic species there that probably aren't found anywhere else right now. So that would make obvious sense. Also, we're going to talk about in the other lecture about industrial scale renewable energy in the Mojave. What does this really make sense to denude land that was pristine habitat and pristine ecosystems to put solar? Solar is great, but are there smarter ways to do it? And we're going to talk about that. Okay? National parks, there's a whole section about national parks, how this is where we should put them with the greatest diversity, but there's only about 1% of the world that's under national parks. We're very fortunate in the West because we have huge areas that are national parks. Okay, and quickly what we want to talk about and highlight is who are the folks that manage this? Well, we're very fortunate that they say that in the Mojave area, in our area, up to 80% of our land is owned by the government. So it's actually our land. And it's managed by people like National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service we talked about earlier, Bureau of Land Management, the biggest one for us, and Fish and Wildlife Service. And they have all kinds of different parks and wilderness areas and level of conservation or protection. And the main thing I want you guys to understand about these, which is both a negative and a positive, is they're what are called multiple use agencies. They have to allow the miner and the renewable energy person to come and ask for a lease of that land because it's open to everyone. And that actually is a good thing because it ensures we don't just put fences around too much of it and take people off it, which I'm against because I think people need to be able to go out there. Even if it is to ride a off-road vehicle and enjoy the desert that way. That's the way, it's public land and it should be that way. And so it makes a challenge for us on how to manage and how to manage all these interests. But it allows us to keep a lot of our land pristine. In the west of the United States, as opposed to Australia, we have huge amounts of fairly well-conserved natural lands. Okay? What's the problem in Park Service lands? Noise, congestion, pollution, damage to vegetation, and wildlife disruption. Well, that goes without saying. I happened to go to Yellowstone this year twice, once when it was almost empty, and once in the middle of summer when it was full. And yes, all these things can happen. But I think that cost is offset by the fact that this is the way we get people to identify with this and to take responsibility and buy in. Okay, damage to non-native species is another, damage from non-native species, mountain goats, European wild boars. Locally here, we have a biological conservation zone with the Mojave Water Agency here that they manage it under the adjudication, and it's all the riparian area along the river here going down towards Barstow. And our big issue there is some wild boar still in there, but mostly it's invasive tamarisk. It's a salt cedar tree that takes over, and we're managing that, okay? Threatened islands of biodiversity. So if these parks aren't big enough, they just become an island, and many animals require way more area than that. They say that a mountain lion requires a 200-mile range. So that's why on a regular basis we get them coming down into our area here and, maybe eating Fluffy the dog or Kitty Cat or something like that. And that's just part of the game. If we just happen to be within their range. And so my opinion, we need to learn how to live with that. Okay, science focus, the wolf. I want you guys to talk about this. I think the book, from my information, from having looked at this in Yellowstone, is a little bit off on this. All the right reasons to reintroduce the wolf to balance. We talked about this earlier. To balance out the populations of elk and moose that were getting out of control and some other smaller herbivores. But now it's gone the other way. And locals are saying, I heard one estimate up to 2,000. And these guys are very, very voracious predators, and it's set the balance the other way to where they're concerned, seriously concerned about especially moose populations in Yellowstone. Very, very hard to see a moose in Grand Tetons and Yellowstone at the moment. And so now we need to manage these. It's called culling. It's part of conservation. We don't like it. There's lots of people that are very pro-wolf that are terribly upset about this, but they have started to put them on the hunting list again so that we could try to bring these numbers down into a proper balance. And again, this is because these parks are an island. The wolf doesn't just get to go off and be somewhere else on some farmer's land because the farmer's going to say, hey, this is my farm. I don't need the wolf here, okay? So they prey on elk and push them to high elevation. They've helped establish biodiversity in Yellowstone, but now we've got also an imbalance. So we're managing it the other way. And that's in just a normal cycle. And we're going to have to work that out. So great conversation for you guys to do some research on biodiversity and its conservation around the wolf. I'd love to see one of the threads be about that. Nature reserves only a small part of the Earth's land, less than 13% is protected. Protect about 20%, Who are some of the groups that do this? We think always of the government, but there's also big NGOs, non-government organization, Nature Conservation, Nature Conservancy, Wildland Conservancy is a local one, started by a guy out of Redlands area, out of Yucaipa. They've had huge ones here. These ones have originally, these that owned by this conservancy, recently been declared as wilderness areas, and we'll talk about that more in the other PowerPoint or the lecture with this that I'm going to do. And so that's the highest level of protection. Just hiking, very limited use of the land, and we've just declared huge areas in the Mojave, all out along Highway 40, the sea and sand coming up from Palm Springs up into the San Bernardinos, across the San Gorgonios, and very controversial because a lot of people believe, I happen to be kind of on that side most of the time, that people need to have access, needs to be multiple use. And the President Obama declared this under a very old law, the Antiquities Act is what it's called, and he's allowed to do that. So, and it's it made a lot of people, some people very happy and some people not so happy. But it's the way it is now, and now how are we going to manage that? Okay. Also, we have some land trusts. The Mojave Land Trust buys up land, especially disturbed land, and puts it under conservation. They're a local group that does that. Okay. Couple of things about nature reserves we want to talk about is the buffer zone, where we have a nature reserve, and then we have less protected but still conserved areas and around it to kind of give it a buffer from overuse by man and other uses. Habitat corridors, where we make sure that we don't isolate these species like the mountain lion. Well, mountain lions are pretty mobile. I was just watching a show the other night. There's one in Griffith Park, which is what, 400 acre park in the middle of LA. Came from way up north to the north, Antelope Valley areas, and they tracked it with a GPS collar, went across several freeways, and now is living in Griffith Park. So in a major city park in LA, we now have a male mountain lion living there, and they're leaving it till, I guess, maybe eat someone, I don't know, but they can migrate. But other animals can't do that, and so up here with our little group of bighorn sheep that we're going to talk about on our field trip, they know for sure that Highway 18 forms a barrier as it goes up to Big Bear for them. So they have corridors. They actually will make, if you go down to Palm Springs, you can see some of these over the 10 freeway. They actually have freeway overpasses that aren't for vehicles, they're for animals, and those are corridors. Or segments of land that connect these areas. And these new wilderness areas definitely do that. They form corridors for some of these species that need a bigger range. Okay, case study, Costa Rica. I'll let you learn about that. They've done an amazing job. They have a real educational focus on sustainability. And they've taken their deforestation from, they had about high 30s to now they have over 50% of their land is reforested. So they've done an amazing job. And they've done it with these in this area. These are the highly protected zones, and then the yellow are the less protected zones. The one we worked with was right in here. Our Sustainable Learning Center we visited was here. And this is for the scarlet macaw that migrates depending on food across here. And actually even flies across here just in one day. That's not very far. Costa Rica isn't a big. So there's certain species focused around, but again, this idea of a national park and then a buffer zone around it. Okay, where there's more protection, more conservation. Wilderness is very controversial, as we've talked about. I don't think we have much land that we could still put in wilderness. I think it kind of needs to be used, but I'm not the only one that gets to decide on that. So 2 million acres get wilderness protection, 50% in length of wild and scenic rivers. So one of the things they're trying to do with Deep Creek, a beautiful little creek, if you've never been up there, hike up in there, it's gorgeous, going up to Big Bear. That's one of the ones that's proposed to be what's called a wild and scenic river. It's one of the wilderness designations. You actually take corridors for the river and you make those into wilderness areas. Okay, so there it is, your 3 huge wilderness areas declared this year. I think it was in about April. So what is ecosystem approach to sustaining terrestrial biodiversity? Going to point out this strategy is really not that important. We've kind of talked about. Well, I want to point out a couple of things that we locally have really looked at. The mapping of global ecosystems. I want to point out geographic information systems. We have a program here at VVC in our department that does this. Going to have the analyst who teaches the class, Brian Hammer, come and give you a guest lecture. We've got to know what we've got first, and then we've got to have these interactive GIS information systems to look at the decisions we need to make to manage these areas, okay? Then we also need to have active restoration. So if you looked at, you remember the Aldo Leopold movie, restoration was a key to what he did over there in Wisconsin, right? And he allowed that, he helped restore, and he allowed it to restore itself. And next moment we had the cranes come back in, right? And there have to be incentives, right? We've got to build into our government incentives ways to help with this. And again, next week we'll look at, we have a couple of examples that the RCD does in terms of using those incentives. Global diversity hotspots, that's a great way to do it. We pick areas of the globe, ecosystem hotspots, and we focus in where the most biodiversity is. That's where we're focusing our attention. A lot of California is considered an ecosystem hotspot. Costa Rica is. So agencies and international groups focus in on those areas, which makes sense because other areas aren't as important, but not that they're not important at all. So here's just a map of those. Obviously a lot along the coast where there's your whole Amazon Delta. The one I've seen has a lot more of California on it. And of course, just the western tip of Australia here, whole big areas of South Africa, the whole island of Madagascar. I think this chapter also has a little case study on Madagascar. Oh, there it is. I'm fortunate to have visited this years and years ago. Amazing place, incredibly undeveloped, incredibly backward in terms of the infrastructure. But they're an island, and therefore they have a lot of endemic species and a lot of pressure on those endemic species. Again, how do we rehabilitate and restore? I'm going to go into that much more in the other lecture. But there's different words for it. We use the word restoration. In mining, we call it reclamation. It's not restoring it totally to what it was, but close to. And then rehabilitation, replacement rehabilitation. Another word you'll see is revegetation. And then establishing or creating artificial ecosystems. This is a really interesting one. The one thing we're using quite a bit now in wastewater management is, because wastewater management at its essence is a biological process. It's just decomposing that stuff using natural microbes and bacteria. And if we can create these, and so we actually have one right here on campus. We just don't think of it as such, but as the water comes off from the fish hatchery, it goes down through the back end of our campus, and they've built up some berms there, and it can sit there for a decent amount of time and just basically naturally decompose basically the waste from those fish, right? And also the city of Humboldt State University, city of Arcata up north, uses their local bay as an artificial, they call them artificial wetlands, and they're treating their wastewater right there in their own bay, and it's pretty incredible. You can walk through it. You know, it's a little bit stinkier than average, but when you understand what they're doing and it's a natural process, and in the end everyone benefits, then you kind of get over the stink a little bit. You guys will get to smell the stink at the wastewater plant, and you'll start to realize, well, it's a little bit stinky, but good and a functional ecosystem, even at the wastewater treatment plant. Okay, ecological restoration. We're not going to go into this much right now because we'll cover this later. We're just going to flip through some of this pretty quickly. Obviously, you're going to identify what caused the degradation. You're going to stop the abuse. You're going to reintroduce species, and you're going to protect from further degradation. Okay. So then there's a nice case study about the Blackfoot Valley in Montana. So then it goes into aquatic biodiversity, and obviously this is very, very important, but we're not going to focus on this class. So you need to look at this and basically what I call read only, which read and just understand the basic principles. The one we're going to look at is that was all ocean. We're going to look at what do we have locally? Well, really what we have locally is all our water comes from underground. It's groundwater. But we have these riparian habitats. So what is a riparian habitat? Anywhere close to the river where we get bigger trees and shrubs that are exposed to a higher water table, and sort of incidentally, once in a while, some flood water and having, might get their roots covered once in a while. That's a riparian. We have one of the best riparian habitats stretching basically here from Victor Valley College going to the north. This crazy underground river, which is not really an underground river, but water that flows through the sediments very slowly underground, the Mojave River going north. So all the way out to about Silver Lakes, even to a certain extent at Barstow, we have these this riparian habitat. And it's very, very critical. Again, it's just like wetlands, a lot of nursery for species. Ours is important as a migratory bird stop. Several endangered species use it. For example, the least bell vireo, which is one of the birds, those little songbirds. And guess what? Population pressures galore. This sits right between 300,000 people, right? Hesperia, Victorville, and everyone else. And everyone else wants to use it. I used to train my horses in that riverbed. So it's under a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure from homeless people, for example. So Great Lakes, lots going on there. We just had the thing in what is that, Lake Superior, with the lead issue in the water. Couple of issues that play over to us. The one would be the zebra mussel. It's a tiny little mussel that is clogging up water pipes. So if you bring your boat from the Colorado and you bring it over to Lake Silverwood, you've got to wash out the bilge tanks to make sure you aren't transporting this guy. The Asian carp takes over certain eastern waters, right? All right, freshwater ecosystems protected through laws, economics, incentives, and restoration efforts. Had a very good guest lecture from Dino Bozanelis the other day about environmental policy, and then we got to look at giving people incentives economically to do the right thing rather than the wrong thing, and then also restoration. Okay, we've got to have, there has to be some incentives for this to happen. Okay, yeah. So 3 big ideas, and we probably should see what Aldo Leopold says. We abuse the land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see the land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. So we have to become part of it. We have to have this land stewardship ethic where we realize we're part of it. We're part of this, part of using it. We're also part of the solution. So thank you very much.